But I did want to say to you and to the camera, congratulations. Your protest about shutting down Parliament and the protest of many others, similarly minded and similarly passionate as you, I thought was truly wonderful, and I choose my words carefully. It was a wonder to me. I was surprised. I was really surprised. I was pleasantly surprised. And sure as hell, the government of Canada, the Prime Minister's office, was really surprised. Because I work with governor generals and things, I have lots of communication with that gang, and when I was just apoplectic about what was happening on December the 30th, and the phrase they used for me was, "Peter, you're an overly sensitive soul." And I thought about that, and emails I tried that, and well, you know what? There may be millions of other overly sensitive souls. So, overly sensitive souls, here we are. And it turned out there were millions of us. I went off to Australia on the 18th of January. I was a trip long planned. I didn't know what was going to happen in December. And my wife and I went. So while you went outside and did your wonderful work for democracy, you went out in the snow, and I went to the sunny beaches of Australia. So I really thank you. I followed on email, and I was just delighted. Your work has not yet produced a remedy for what happened, but as I will explain later in this lecture, the Canadian people's disapproval of this use of prorogation that we saw in this December and also the December before will be instrumental, I think, in establishing over time. You hear those two words, you may not like those two words, those two. He's wobbling, my God, over time. You can't wait, and I don't like to wait, but I'll explain why we have to wait. Over time, a constitutional convention governing Prime Minister requests for prorogation. But first, before I get to all that, I'd like to talk a little bit more generally about what ails our system of parliamentary government at the federal level in Canada. A recent study, I'll show it to you, by a very informed group of UK, British scholars, authorized by the Institute of Government in London, which is a kind of think tank, non-partisan, for both Parliament and the British government. So we don't have anything quite like it in Canada. They, about a year ago, were thinking that the United Kingdom might be into minority parliaments. So they did a study of how minority parliaments are working in the Westminster world, where we have the sort of Westminster parliamentary model. And the key places they went were New Zealand, which has had lots of minority parliaments since it adopted proportional representation. Scotland, which you must say Scotland, yeah, that's a quasi-independent part of the United Kingdom now, and has a proportion of parliament based on a system of proportional representation. They went there. They came here. And boy, did they come here. And they looked closely. And this is their report. Chapter 3 is on Canada, and it's headed, Canada's Dysfunctional Minority Parliament. In essence, what that chapter tells its readers being mostly senior British public servants and as part of the interested public, and certainly active political people in UK, particularly party leaders. And it basically says, if you want to know what not to do when you have what's called a Hun Parliament, if you want to sort of get a real roadmap of disaster, well, you watch Canada. And then they spell out what's wrong. And look at the evidence. I'll just run over it very briefly. You've been living through it. 3 elections since 2004. And that's puts us really into a 204, 206, 208. It seems to be putting us into a 2-year election cycle. You know, we're supposed to be very grateful that we may not have an election this spring, but all the media say, oh yeah, but you know, maybe we'll get through the spring, but we'll have it in the fall. For sure, for sure. Now, I don't know whether they're right, I hope they're wrong, but I want to tell you, there are 51 parliamentary democracies in the world, of which we're one. None of them have a 2-year election cycle. That's for a very good reason. When you have elections every 2 years, the parties and their politicians in Parliament are in a constant state of what I call electionitis. All they can think of is scoring points against one another, preparing for the next election. As far as I know, we're the only parliamentary democracy, and certainly it's the first time in our history, that the 2 major parties have attack ads running, very expensive. There was not even an election, announced and going at it very heavy. So they spend their time sniping at each other and preparing for the election. I was just fascinated with the Liberal conference in Montreal last weekend. What happened? Well, we know that there are some ideas going into what? Into parliamentary committees to discuss legislation or policy? No! They're getting ready, their platform ready for the next election. This is, virtually sick, in my view, to be simply that hot to trot for the next election. And think about our elections. Our turnout is falling. It's particularly dangerous to see it falling among younger people. They're very turned out. And our politicians, the only thing of the major parties, Liberals and Conservatives, not to say the largest parties, seem just hell-bent for leather on getting ready for another election. And you might well ask, and I'll come back to this, whatever happened to the Fixed Date Election Act? Elections every 4 years. It was all 4 parties, and I can tell you with some enthusiasm, and unanimously endorsed way, way, way back in 2007. Stone Age, isn't it? My God. Were they just kidding? I'll come back to that. And they adopted that legislation and wanted it for very good reasons, and are now ignoring it. Not just Mr. Harper, but just as much, I'd say, the Liberals. So that's a terrible record for the last 6 years. And during most of that period, there's a couple of exceptions, Parliament has not been engaged in what Parliament should do. It should be leading public discussion on the big issues of the day, introducing legislation and policies to deal with them. The war in Afghanistan, climate change and carbon emissions, employment insurance reform, pension reform, and so on. That's what Parliament's all about. It's supposed to be addressing those issues, bringing in measures, putting up policies, debating and discussing them, and it seldom does that. Most of the time, it's partisan sniping, trying to find something wrong with what the opposition are proposing or the government is doing. So Parliament is simply failing to fulfill its function. And then we've had 3 constitutional crises. We had one in November, December 2008.